The rights activist group Equal Education say they are disappointed that the Department of Basic Education has failed both to meet their deadline and the promise to ensure the safety of teachers and learners. This follows Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga announcing yesterday that many schools across the country are not ready to reopen because personal protective equipment has not been delivered yet, and it is also due to the fact that there is still a lack of access to running water at some schools. The new deadline for grades 7 and 12 to return is Monday, the 8th of June. The education rights activist group also says that the department's current action mirrors the failures in the past, such as the provision of textbooks, essential infrastructure like toilets and scholar patrol. Well, joining us now from Equal Education, we are joined by Noncedo Madubedube, and she, of course, will be talking to us about these issues and more. Good to have you. Thanks so much for being with us on the program.
Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to talk to communities in general about what to expect during this period and how we can all support the reopening process.
It is important to have voices from all different sectors when it comes to education. Now, I suppose the first question I need to ask you is, do you think that the poorer children in South Africa are going to be left behind? Because, you know, this academic year is really hanging in the midst right now, while the Department of Basic Education is trying to sort things out.
Well, the first thing I think we have to have a reorientation of what education and schools provide for children. So we aren't working towards ensuring that we can save what's left of the academic year. We're thinking about what learners want. Now, members have said to us, it's difficult to be at home because you have to juggle housework and schoolwork. They've got responsibilities now they wouldn't have if they were otherwise at school. The levels of protection and structure that they get from the schooling environment, especially able to build community as well. The unfortunate thing is that as the minister spoke yesterday, they spoke about a 55% readiness of schools across the country. Now we know where these schools are. We know that these are schools in quintile 4 and 5. These are independent schools that are small in size, are able to sort of galvanize themselves and get the equipment necessary and procure all of the things that they need. Those schools that rely solely on government support to reopen are struggling at the moment. We've had reports from schools in the Eastern Cape that weren't able to get PPE and or water at all, and had promised to do that over the weekend, but weren't able to do those things. We know that Mpumalanga is lacking behind. We know that Limpopo and KZN are having severe issues with being able to put in place just the bare essentials to get schools open. And so when the government says to us, or the Department of Basic Education says to us, look, when we're at 80% readiness of all schools across the country, we'll open for everyone. And we were asking the school community just is patient with us and waits for the 8th of June as a reopening. That also worries us, because who is at 20%? This is an opportunity, I think, for everyone to work towards a better socioeconomically equal South Africa. We're the most unequal country in the world, and that is showing or case in point in our education system. So we really plea with the Department of Basic Education, the provincial departments of education, to get their act together and ensure that all schools will be ready to open on the 8th of June. The last thing that I must mention is that there are 4 factors in particular that are critical for people across the country to galvanize themselves, mobilize, get information, go into schools, ask principals about, to ensure that schools open, and bang down the doors of HODs in different provincial departments. The 4 things that are necessary in order for people to come back into a school environment. The school must have water and soap. And this is advice coming from colleagues at the College of Medicine in South Africa. We must have water and soap, but the government said yesterday to us, look, over 3,100 schools don't have any form of water supply in their schools. It's shocking that this is the case. We know that there's a need for safe and adequate provision of sanitation. We know that over 3,700 schools still only have plain pit latrines as a source of sanitation. This is also shocking, and these are the things that need to be eradicated, or at least plans put in place and some movement on the ground to ensure that learners go back to an environment that is safe on Monday. The last is around spacing. Now, whatever model the government, Department of Basic Education in particular, decides to use to orientate the phased-in approach to schooling, there will be a need to think about mapping communities, finding spaces for other grades to come back. I mean, the minister said yesterday there's going to be chaos when grade 8s get back, grade 10s get back to school. That's just, it's absurd to have a minister of basic education not think about how far and well and comprehensively they've planned in conversation, engagement with teachers and learners and people inside the school community to ensure that chaos doesn't ensue inside our schools.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how you use that kind of language to address a nation. The fourth, and I'm nearly done, is around scholar transport. The provision of this kind of necessity is critical to ensuring that school learners go into the school environment safe and ready to learn. And so the provision of this transport is critical, but also the capacity directions on how scholar transport will be run during this period. In one of the parliamentary meetings, the deputy minister said, someone said, look, we already have a short of buses or cars to get children to school. What's going to happen when the capacity rate is 50% now as per regulations? And she said, oh, we'll just get more scholar transport. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So we need the Department of Basic Education to stop setting the bar too high, get these essentials inside schools, and work with provincial departments and civil society to ensure that it's an all-hands-on-deck approach. And we really actually do need interventions from the president at this point. Yeah. We need the NCC to make sure that Angie Motshekga is making the right decisions and truly consulting people to ensure that we have the best plan for the next 4 days at least.
Okay. All right. So I'm glad you've outlined your position. So we'll quickly just have a couple more questions around this, just in the interest of time, to try and keep them a little bit shorter. So, you know, what you're saying here is it almost has nothing to do with coronavirus and COVID-19 and the readiness, because my standpoint on this is that, and the question I'm asking you, should these schools have been operating in the beginning? Because they are not COVID compliant to go back. They don't have running water, they don't have soaps, they don't have toilets. How were they legally operating in the first place? You know, it should have nothing to do with coronavirus. The standpoint should have been taken years ago. Is this not the facts?
I don't want to say it shouldn't have been operating, because we also know that Department of Basic Education has been on a mission to rationalize schools without consultation. So many schools in rural communities are being shut down, and learners are having to walk long distances to get to the nearest school. So what I want to rather advise and show to South Africa and pressure on the Department of Basic Education that it's simply unacceptable for them to have a law that was signed by Angie Motshekga herself, the norms and standards for school infrastructure, that say these are the bare necessities that a school needs to have by year 2016 and year 2020 to ensure that a school is able to operate at its best. And those conditions haven't been provisioned for learners that come from poor and marginalized communities. That's an injustice, but it happens across the country. Yeah. So this is a moment for, I think, sort of a national agenda for us to really consider, despite the complexities of the virus and all the things that are needed to be in place, the procurements, but it's important that we all galvanize around it, creating an ecosystem. A lot of people are saying to us, things are complex. If we're ready, can't we open? No, we can't open. Some can't go to school while others sit at home. Yeah. The provisions of things like online learning and support for learners at home isn't a luxury or pleasure that others get to enjoy. And how do we feel comfortable with living in a country as unequal as this one? And the education system is it's like a big sort of case in point to this.
Yeah, you know, it almost gets to a point now where there needs to be solidarity with these schools that don't have anything and that have been operating without, as you say, the basics. I mean, whether it be soap, whether it be textbooks, desks, a roof over their head. I mean, there was a school that we were broadcasting from yesterday out in the Eastern Cape where, you know, there were holes in the roof. The desks were broken. There was bird poo all over the floor. The place hadn't been cleaned. And this was a grade, I may be corrected, but I think it was either a 12 or a 7, I'm not sure, but it was one of the classrooms that was meant to be fully operational yesterday. There almost comes a time when a standpoint needs to be taken by schools that are prepared to say, no, we stand in solidarity with other schools and other learners that don't have, and it's time now that they are prepared. Is this really showing us the gaps in the education sector, and that the Basic Education Department needs to do more to fix these schools and act much quicker with regard to fixing this education sector?
I mean, absolutely. And the thing that's sort of disheartening at the moment is that the response to COVID and the reopening of schools surely involves an interministerial approach. Yeah. But it seems as though government isn't even able to adequately coalesce their work streams to ensure that these things happen. And an all hands on deck approach also means business needs to get involved. But the challenge is that principals feel under threat by the departments of education provincially. And so the ability to be able to come to organizations like EE and say, look, these are the challenges, has them a little bit nervous or scared for their jobs and their professional obligations. So we do need community at community level for business to think about how do we support schools? Is there a need to donate additional water tanks in these schools? Is there a need to think about donating face masks for teachers and for learners? All kinds. And I think the result of the 8th of June being the next date for schools to reopen is because schools that are in quintile 3, 4, and 5, rather, were able to recognize in the joint meeting with the minister that when some schools aren't ready, it's not the best moral position to open regardless. Yeah. And so maybe there is some kind of understanding and a building of consensus inside that body, but it definitely needs some injection and voice from learners, for example, because those are the people that are at the experiential level of receiving a sort of a traditional teaching and learning environment. Yeah. And so I think it's important to also, just in the vein of what you're saying, this is my last point here, is that there was a group of activists and academics in the Eastern Cape that had called for a rural community stimulus in relation to education. So I think the stimulus package that has come from government needs to also come into the education sector. We need to think about how we equitably support the schools in rural provinces and in peri-urban communities in the urban provinces as well.
Yeah. Just, Noncedo, in terms of readiness to go back on Monday, I mean, this weekend was, I imagine, for anybody involved in the education sector, not to mention parents, was a roller coaster, because you thought it was happening on Monday. You were waiting for a press conference that constantly got delayed and moved forward a day. And then when eventually Sunday arrived, where your child is going to school the next day, and then the press conference is called off, and then you have to guess whether schools are opening or not. And we had to wait later for a press briefing to say, no, it's not going to I mean, the chaos that was caused over this weekend has detrimental and lasting effects on a lot of people. So my question to you is, do you think they will be ready come next Monday? And, you know, they haven't been able to get ready for all these decades. Will these schools be ready now, those that don't even have water?
Schools will probably get themselves, I think, to this 80% mark that the Department of Basic Education has called for. But I think in order to make sure that all schools can go back, we need to think about how do we approach and talk to the NCC, the presidency, the National Solidarity Fund needs to think about how we could support schools. All these national structures and interministerial social clusters need to really invest their energy in ensuring that schools are open. The worrying thing is that this isn't just an education issue, right? I think because the country is going to level 3, we're opening up different strands of the economy. It puts pressure then on the Department of Basic Education, whether ready or not, whether they have the capacity or not, to open schools, because there are big issues around caregiving, right? And who's going to be at home to monitor and watch out for young people during this period. So I think it's a careless communication strategy that's coming from the Department of Education. But case in point, the little's ability to be able to run a fully functional and equitable and quality education system. So a lot of people in different formations are saying, look, we are not ready to open schools, but we're worried about what this means for learners. And so we do want schools to open. And we're just imploring the Department of Basic Education, the provincial education departments to roll up their socks and get going, but involve our full communities to ensure that things are done right as schools open.
Two very, very quick questions to you, if you don't mind being as fast as you can with the answers. We're running into time problems. The Western Cape, they reopened their school yesterday despite what the minister said. What are your thoughts on this?
That's curious, because I would have understood that MECs and the unions were on the same page coming out of their joint meeting on Saturday. So it's curious that the Western Cape Department felt that they need to stick to law, whether morally correct or not, and open schools. We're now tracking inside of Equal Education the different schools in the Western Cape that don't actually have the provision of the basics. So things like running water. And we're grateful that South African Human Rights Commission has called out the Western Cape Premier and the MEC to say, look, you can't open. We had agreed on this program of action. So it's just a province that's able to sit inside its inequalities quite comfortably. And we're seeing that in real time.
Yeah. Final one, the story that we've been leading with the entire morning here is the call for the Basic Education Minister to actually step down and to step aside. I mean, the Educators Union of South Africa saying she must vacate her position, saying she's given up the cause and the fight to ensure learner safety, and also that High Court application in Pretoria, hearing the union's application to interdict the reopening of schools. Do you think she should step aside and take responsibility for the shambles that's happening right now?
I mean, I think that's the same union body that called for teachers to take up arms, right, to protect themselves from learners. But anyways, I don't think it's an Angie Motsafa issue. I think it's a government issue that we're facing. I think the government needs to think deeply about what social pedagogy means inside our education system in order to create a just society, the best kind of South Africa that we can have at the moment. And I think it's just case in point across what an ANC government is doing to our different provinces. So rural provinces need stimulus, whether the Minister of Basic Education is Angie Motsafa or not. So I don't think a call for her removal is the best thing that we could call for during this period. What we need to be focusing on is how do we get water into these schools? How do we ensure that there's an eradication of plain pit latrines? And how do communities, including parents, ensure that their schools are ready? I mean, their children are ready, whether it's testing at home, what kind of information do they need to support that process? And better public information around the causes and the best prevention measures that we can take during this pandemic. Because we were apparently going to live in a world of pandemics in any case. That's the orientation we need now. But government needs to bring us into their confidence.
Yeah, Noncedo, thank you very, very much for talking to us. Noncedo Madubedube from Equal Education talking to us about the current situation of schools as they gear up to reopen next Monday. Quick break.